Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name is Nick Salmond. I'm a Blue Badge Guide for London and one of 600 members of the Association of Professional Tourist Guides. That's the organisation that runs the Guide London website. Usually at this time of year, we'd be out showing London to our visitors, but we can't do that this year because London's in lockdown. So we're stuck in our houses, and we've been thinking of ways which we can still reach out to people and bring a little bit of London into your home. We've been doing that through our series of live broadcasts. This time in the afternoon, that's 4 in the afternoon if you're in the UK, or 11 in the morning if you're on the east coast of America. We've been doing a series of live broadcasts, bringing a little bit of London to you. If you've been able to join us over the last few weeks, you would have heard presentations on things like films set in London, books in London, some of the history of the city, things like the Great Fire of London. On Monday, we had a great talk about 2 art galleries, the National Portrait Gallery and Tate Modern, both of which are worth a visit when eventually you're allowed to come and visit London. Now, if you've missed any of those broadcasts, then you can find them all on either our website, on the Facebook page, or on the YouTube channel. All you have to do is go and search for Guide London, and you will find all the broadcasts there. And I do urge you to go and have a look at them. Today is Wednesday, and Wednesday is our History Day. And today we're going to look at the history of one very particular building. It's a very important building to London, and it's a building that we as Blue Badge Guides probably get asked to go and take people to visit more than any other building in London, and that's Westminster Abbey, the great church that stands at the heart of London, right next door to the Houses of Parliament. Very important for many reasons, not least because it's the place where we crown our kings and queens. Coronations have been happening in Westminster Abbey since 1066. It's a place where royal weddings and funerals take place. And it's also the resting place of some of the great and the good of the country. All those people you've read about in history books. As you wander through the Abbey, you can see where a lot of them are buried. Poets, authors, architects, all kinds of people buried in Westminster Abbey. We have 2 Blue Badge Guides who are going to join me today to talk about the Abbey. Kate Davey is joining us. Kate's going to talk about the early history of the Abbey and a little bit about the building that is features most strongly in the Abbey today. The building that you see as you wander around is mostly dates from the 13th century, built under the instructions of King Henry III, and Kate is going to tell you a little bit about that. And then Simon Whitehouse will join us. Simon is going to tell us a little bit about the later history of the Abbey and about some of the things that happen in the Abbey today and some of the things you can see if you come and visit, and we do hope you do come and visit when the lockdown is finally lifted. Now, we are broadcasting live, so if you've got any questions, then do write them in the comments. We'd love to try and answer them. And do share this broadcast with your friends. We'd love as many people as possible to see the broadcasts so that you can then come and visit, and we'll show you places like Westminster Abbey in person. So to start off, I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's going to tell us all about the early history of Westminster Abbey. Kate.
Thanks, Nick. Hello, everyone. My name's Kate Davey. I'm an architectural historian. I'm a London Blue Badge Guide, and I'm also a barrister, a lawyer here in the Temple, about a mile down the river from Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey is my favourite building. It was built between 1245 and 1272 by King Henry III. He is one of my all unsung heroes. He is the 4th longest reigning monarch that we've had thus far, and he was a great patron of the arts. He built Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style. You can see from our overview of the Abbey that involves a lot of very pointed arches, elegant flying buttresses, and soaring roofs. Henry III is buried there, and let's have a look at him, meet him and his effigy. Now, before you rush into Westminster Abbey and look for your favourite scientists, Sir Isaac Newton, your favourite memorial, or maybe to Shakespeare, or walk in the footsteps of Kate Middleton as she went to meet her prince, I'd like to look at Henry III's work, artistically and in terms of sculpture and architecture. He was not only a great patron of the arts, but he was someone who had a great eye, and he would see something he liked, and we have his records, he'd then say, I want a wooden roof made to look like stone, exactly like the one I saw last week at Lichfield. Let's go to the entrance of the Abbey and you'll see more of this wonderful Gothic style. There's a flying buttress holding the Abbey up. And now let's go into the Abbey. There you'll see the nave, and it's a beautiful contrast of the pillars, which are black Purbeck marble from the south of England and white Reigate stone. The contrast would have been even greater in the 1200s. These days, the Purbeck has mellowed to brown and the white to grey, but it would have been a dramatic black and white contrast. And around those pointed arches, the little decorations would have been picked out in red, blue, and gold gilt, some of which, if you look carefully, you can still see. This was a new style. The Gothic style had evolved in France, and Henry liked nothing better than keeping up with his arch rivals, the French. Let's walk further into the Abbey to the more sacred eastern arm. Here you can see the great height of Westminster Abbey. This was very much a French idea. They built high, the English tended to build long and lower. The proportions of the Abbey are 3:1, height to width. So this would have been quite dramatic and surprising to anyone who came to the Abbey. Henry employed an architect called Henry de Reims, or Henry of Reims in France. We don't know too much about him except that he was a brilliant architect, but given his name, he was either trained in the French Coronation Cathedral or he was born there, hence his name. Henry III spent about £41,000 on Westminster Abbey, and it took him many decades. It's hard to extrapolate that into money today, but it was roughly 2 years' income from the entire English exchequer. Henry III was, at times when he wanted to be, an absolute monarch and could spend a lot of the income on his building programme. Well, why did Henry build in this style, and why at this time? There had been an abbey on this site for hundreds of years. The previous abbey, next slide please. There's the rose windows of the south transept, again a French feature you'll be familiar with from Notre Dame. The previous abbey was in a very different style. On the left, you have the Bayeux tapestry, and it shows the builder of the previous abbey, Edward the Confessor, a king. Confessor just means that he was renowned for his piety. And he's talking to his subjects outside Westminster Abbey. On the right, you have a reconstruction of the Norman or Romanesque style, a very heavy style with rounded arches, ideally suited to the marshy area on which it was built. But by 1245, this would have seemed very old-fashioned indeed. There are traces of Edward the Confessor's Abbey, which he finished in 1066. This is the Pyx Chamber. You'd really need a guide in order to find this, but it's a room that is now nearly 1,000 years old. Henry swept away the Confessor's Abbey, aside from a few vestiges. And he was probably our first monarch who built with artistic motivation. He didn't just build for political and religious expediency. And he also wanted everything in the up-to-minute fashion, and he wanted to make it better than his arch rival, Louis IX of France. He also changed his mind. That was the monarch's prerogative as years went on. Next slide, please. This is Temple Church, which I can see here from my sitting room. It is also in the Gothic style, but the early English Gothic style. And again, to Henry, this would have looked very old-fashioned by 1245, mainly because of its windows. If you look on the left, this is where Henry had chosen to be buried, right in the centre there of the chancel. But the Gothic architecture of this style was limited by its windows, those thin lancet windows, as we call them. If you wanted a bigger window, all you could do was just put lots of lancets next to each other. Next slide, please. Henry was well aware of a French development called tracery. That is the pattern that you can make out of stone in a window to make a huge glass window. And you can see here that there is almost a glass wall, called a glass cage aesthetic by Professor Wilson. This is the chapter house at Westminster Abbey, one of the first bits of the abbey to be finished in 1250. The chapter house was where the monks, Westminster Abbey was a monastery, had, if you like, a daily monks' assembly, rather like an administrative centre. But it's also an important building because Henry III had a very difficult relationship with his nobles. It was the beginning of the parliamentary system, and he and his nobles would parley in this room. So it's constitutionally important too. But look at its glorious aesthetics. See that central pillar bloom up organically, rather like a flower, and then drop into those magnificent glass windows. The stained glass, by the way, is not original. It's 19th century. There's a little bit of stained glass left up in the gallery. So he was building up to the minute and in a very beautiful style indeed. He was a deeply religious monarch. All monarchs at the time were religious to an extent, but Henry was extremely pious. When he visited Louis IX, Louis IX organised his route so that he didn't go past too many churches because Henry stopped saying to say mass at each church he went past. But the central part of Henry's abbey was the shrine of Edward the Confessor that we met, built the earlier abbey. Henry wanted a beautiful shrine for him, and he built this shrine. It's the original one, apart from the wooden canopy on top. It was encrusted with jewels, which have now gone, mosaics, and stonework called cosmati, named after the Italian craftsman who did this very detailed and complex cosmati patterning. And that shrine is still his shrine today. Because Edward was a king as well as a saint, the king status beat the saintly status at the Reformation, and his body was not, save very briefly, removed. And he's still in there. We did some geophysics not long ago. His body is in there. And in 2018, the archaeologists at the Abbey took the top off the shrine and we were able to see his coffin. So it's a very unusual survival, both as a shrine and as a shrine that still has a saint's body in it. I mentioned the cosmati pavement. We'll have a look at that in a minute, but just look to the left of this picture and you will see there is another tomb, and that is the one of Henry III himself. He always wanted to be buried right next to his beloved saint. Henry too has cosmati and mosaic on his tomb. It's hard to see from the picture, but the cosmati is at the height. If you reach up your hand, the cosmati is higher than you can get your hand. And that's because thieves have taken all the little pieces up to hand raised above your head height. There's still a lovely bit of Egyptian porphyry there in the middle of the tomb, and the tomb survives fairly battered. The cosmati pavement around it is well worn, but it survives in front of the high altar. And it is a very richly laid cosmati pavement, recently conserved. The Abbey has a crack team of conservation experts working full-time there. The roundel that you can see in the middle is where the coronation chair stands facing the altar for every coronation, still highly symbolic. And there used to be an inscription round this pavement that predicted the end of the world. The inscription has gone, but we have antiquarian records of it. Fortunately, it predicted that the end of the world would be 19,683 years from the date that the pavement was laid. So we are safe for a time being. It is really great that Henry III survived assassination attempts, civil wars, illness, being rounded on by his own son at one stage, Edward I, survived to see Edward translated into his beautiful shrine with a huge mass at the high altar on the 13th of October in 1269. And the Abbey still celebrates that. If you come in October, there's a week of celebrations which you can participate in. So that floor is one of the most beautiful objects in the Abbey, and recently it's been exposed, so you can climb the steps and now have a look at it. The coronation was hugely important to Henry III, more so than to other monarchs, because Henry's legacy from his father, notorious King John, was a terrible one. King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215 and characteristically, sneakily, reneged on it a couple of months later. The barons then invited Louis of France, Prince Louis then, to invade Britain, which he did, and occupied London and various other important places. John fled, dropped the crown jewels on the riverbed in his haste, and died of a surfeit of cider and peaches, or possibly he was poisoned a couple of weeks after that. 9-year-old Henry III, therefore, couldn't be crowned at Westminster, where every monarch had been crowned since 1066, and didn't have a crown. They used his mother's bracelet, and unsurprisingly, it's recorded that after his coronation, he burst into tears. Fortunately, by 1220, the French had left, there'd been battles, and there'd also been bribes, and Henry was crowned properly at Westminster Abbey. He's the only monarch to be crowned twice as King of England. Other monarchs have been crowned as King of France or as Monarch of Scotland, but Henry's the only one who's had 2 English coronations. So you can see psychologically, as well as for political and constitutional reasons, why he wanted a coronation church of great splendour, and again to rival that of Reims in France. But you'll be wondering, wasn't one of the purposes of Henry III's rebuilding to build a beautiful mausoleum, perhaps to rival Saint-Denis in France, if you like, a type of Valhalla almost, where the great and the good would be buried for hundreds of years to come? Well, not really. Suddenly, he wanted to be buried there himself. He directed, as soon as the first stone was laid here, that he wasn't going to be buried in the Temple Church anymore. He was going to be buried here in Westminster Abbey, a great leap of faith because it had hardly started building. But if you look at the bottom of the picture, there's Henry III in the bottom right, shrine bottom middle. There's a very limited number of spaces for tombs round the all-important shrine. And I think Henry was simply building for his immediate family, because the fashion was that you endowed a church and you were buried there with your immediate family. Westminster Abbey hadn't been the burial place for our monarchs. No one had been buried there between Henry III and all the way back to Edward the Confessor. They'd always endowed their own church and been buried there. His parents were buried in Worcester and in France, the French lands, of course, lost by John. If we then look at what happened when that space filled up, next slide, please. This is the side chapel of St. Edmund. And on the left, you see in the middle, there's a little entrance to the chapel. On the left is the tomb of William de Valence, that's Henry III's half-brother. And on the right of the entrance, the tomb of John of Eltham, that's Edward II's younger son. These close royals were originally buried up in the shrine. But as time moved on, there was no room for them. The shrine is just behind this photo. And they were relegated down into the side chapel. And if you imagine, if we look back 2 generations of our royal family, people who were the brothers of, say, George V would have been very important at the time, but now we'd struggle to remember who they are. And that's the same with these royals from the 1200s. But here we can see that these are beautiful tombs in their own right. And this really sums up the Abbey. They're important politically, in terms of the monarchy, but also as exquisite works of art. Let's look closer at the tombs. The top 2 are the tomb of John of Eltham. There's his tomb on the right, and you can just see 2 angels are carrying his soul up to heaven on his pillow. It's made of English alabaster, very easy to carve, very easy to wear away, and therefore a very rare survival of our beautiful English alabaster. And around his tomb, we have these absolutely stunning weepers. Despite the way they're swaying, they look as if they're dancing. In fact, that was just a style. It's called the Gothic sway. They are actually weeping for young John of Eltham, who died aged 20, having been regent of the country for a while. And this really sums up the Abbey, doesn't it? Every tomb is worth looking at for who's in it, but also what it looks like. Underneath is William de Valence, Henry's half-brother, because his mother married again when John was dead. And William de Valence, an older style, but if you look carefully at his pillow, you can see that it is brightly coloured. It's a style called chambre levée, and one of only 5 tombs in the world to have this patterning. It's a metal framework with enamel in it. It's fired and polished and made to look like a jewel. This is why you have to spend so much time in the Abbey, because there is so much to see and it's very easy to miss these beautiful details. The art and the sculpture has not survived as well as the architecture. There was a lot of iconoclasm at the Reformation in the 1500s and again in the 1600s. On the left is a sensing angel, an angel with an incense burner, sensing people as they walk into the north door. It still has its original colour on it. It survived because it is high up and very difficult to access. It was very hard to get up there and destroy it. And on the right are 2 beautiful survivals, just before 1300, these. On the left-hand side with the red background is St. Thomas the Apostle, Doubting Thomas, and on the right, St. Christopher. I mentioned Henry's great piety. He not only had the remains of Edward the Confessor, but he also had the footprint in stone of Christ, the girdle of the Virgin Mary, and the arm of Doubting Thomas, which I think is why Thomas is given a prominent position here in the south transept. This survived, these 2 paintings, because there was a much later tomb in front of them, and we only discovered them again in 1936. So I hope you can see that the Abbey is worth exploring, not only for its famous people buried there, and not only for its political and constitutional significance, but also as a work of art. And I hope that too, that you will want to know a little bit more about one of my great heroes, Henry III, who I think deserves more recognition. We would love to see you in London when things get better and when things open up for business. You can find my details, Kate Davey, on the Guide London website, and Simon, Nick, and I will be delighted to see you in London. I'm now going to hand over to my friend Simon Whitehouse, who will bring us up to date and introduce us to some of the personalities in the Abbey.
Thank you, Kate, for that illuminating insight into the life and reign of King Henry III. My name's Simon. I'm a London Blue Badge guide. I guide, of course, all over London. And like Kate, the Abbey is my favourite building to guide in London, because I can't think of any other building which completely encapsulates the whole story of British history, religion, the story of the development of the state. If you only had 2 hours in London, Westminster Abbey would be the place to visit. And just picking up on that idea of coronations, so right from the beginning, it has been the Coronation Church. We've had 40 monarchs since William the Conqueror, 1066, right through to the present day, Queen Elizabeth II. And out of 40 monarchs, we've had 38 coronations. In case you're wondering what happened to 2 of them, King Edward V in 1483 sadly died, possibly murdered, before he was able to be crowned in the Abbey. And in 1936, another King Edward, this time King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne before he had chance to be crowned in the Abbey. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the coronation ceremony was all about spectacle. And in this image, which is the coronation of King George IV in 1821, I think you can really get that idea of the sheer number of people that were present. And you can see, in fact, the coronation chair there just in the distance, again, facing the high altar. And not all coronations have gone terribly smoothly. This one was interrupted somewhat, in fact, by King George IV's estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, who rushed back from exile in Italy, banging on the doors of the Abbey, demanding to be let in. And she was told, in fact, that she couldn't be let in because she didn't have a ticket, which always seems to me a peculiarly British excuse. But we now move on to the most recent coronation in the 20th century. and we can see, in fact, 3 images of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And this was an absolutely defining moment in British history in the 20th century. 2nd of June 1953, 26-year-old Queen Elizabeth was crowned. You can see her returning down the nave of the Abbey on the left-hand side with her ladies in attendance. And you can see her in the bottom right there, sitting on that coronation chair, that 14th century chair, wearing the coronation crown, the crown of Edward the Confessor. What made it so extraordinary, of course, was that this was a modern coronation. Even though it had all the trappings of the medieval ceremony, it was a modern coronation because it was the first one to be televised. And an extraordinary 27 million people in this country watched the ceremony on 2.5 million television sets. So it really was extraordinary. And the Abbey can hold around capacity of about 2,000 people. 8,000 guests were in attendance at the ceremony on the 2nd of June. And of course, Queen Elizabeth is still reigning supreme today, the longest reigning monarch in the world. So coronations and also royal weddings have played a significant part in the life of the Abbey. We've had 16 royal weddings in the history of the Abbey, and this, in fact, is a black and white photograph of the wedding of Princess Elizabeth, as she then was in 1947, to her husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. And this was on the 20th of November. So again, and if we move on to the next slide, we can see the most recent royal wedding that's taken place in the Abbey, and that was the wedding of the Queen's grandson, Prince William, on the right-hand side, in red, and his bride, Catherine Middleton, now the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. And of course, for many people visiting the Abbey, this is often, you know, their initial link to the Abbey, that they've seen the wedding, and compared to the coronation, I mean, this was seen on a worldwide scale by 2 billion people in April 2011. And you can just see the Cosmati pavement there in the photograph on which they are standing. So again, that wonderful sense of continuity. Not just celebrations, but also solemn occasions. And we can now see, again, a very memorable image of the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, which took place in Westminster Abbey in 1997. You can see the floral tributes surrounding the coffin that's being carried out of the Abbey. And again, for many people, this is a very strong historical and cultural memory. Now I want to show you another part of the Abbey, which in a way marks the beginning of the modern Abbey. Seems hard to believe this, but this is the most spectacular part of the entire Abbey, in my opinion. This is the chapel of King Henry VII on the right-hand side, and it was completed in 1512, and that really was the beginning of the modern era. So King Henry III would be amazed to see this incredible structure. The ceiling is one of the greatest examples of perpendicular Gothic, the third and final stage of English Gothic architecture on display. And the flags that you can see there, the banners, are connected to the Order of the Bath, which is an ancient order of chivalry, which is a living order, and those represent the living members of the Order of the Bath, who, by the way, have the opportunity to get married in this chapel, should they wish to do so. King Henry VII was the founder of the Tudor dynasty, and we often mark that date as the beginning of modern British history. His successor was his son, King Henry VIII, who, of course, embarked on this great religious and political upheaval, and the Reformation was begun during his reign, and that marked, of course, the separation of the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, and that was the beginning of England becoming a Protestant country from being a Roman Catholic country. You can see here in this image of the Henry VII chapel the beautiful tomb figures of Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York, and they were carved by an Italian sculptor called Torrigiano. And again, these works of art are something that we as guides are always very keen to point out to people. This is really the beginning of Renaissance sculpture in Britain. So again, something to see. King Henry VIII had 3 children, 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and this is the magnificent tomb of Elizabeth and Mary. So Mary was his eldest daughter. She was the daughter of King of Henry and Catherine of Aragon. She was raised a Roman Catholic, and Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and she was raised a Protestant. So in life, the 2 sisters were divided by their religions, but they are buried together in this chapel, united in death. So there's a sort of idea of reconciliation, I suppose, that is part of the story of the Abbey. By the 18th century, we were now, I should just add, by the way, that the last monarch to be buried in the Abbey was in 1760, and that was the Hanoverian King George II. And by that point, the Abbey was getting pretty full up. And we decided also, I think, that we want to celebrate the life of the nation and really honour the great and the good that have contributed to the life of this country. And in the next image, we can see an area of the Abbey known as Scientists' Corner. And there are 3 scientists that are buried in this part of the Abbey, what we call a cluster burial. On the left-hand side, we can see the monument to Sir Isaac Newton. He was the father of gravity, of course, and that's his monument. He's buried just at the foot of the monument. You can just see over to the upper right with the flowers on the grey slab. That's the burial place of Charles Darwin, the father of evolution in the middle of the 19th century. And to bring us right up to date, in 2018, on the bottom right, you can see the memorial plaque to Stephen Hawking, and his ashes are interred underneath there. So I always think, if they ever get a chance to talk to each other, they'll all be talking about the most recent sort of scientific developments with each other. Now, as well as scientists, we also honour some of the greatest writers in the land. And this is an image of Poets' Corner, which I always think is one of the great highlights of a tour. And if you're lovers of literature, this is really a great pilgrimage site. Just in the back of the image, you can see a beautiful stained glass window. Just below that, you can see an alcove, and that contains the tomb of Geoffrey Chaucer, who was buried in the Abbey in 1400. And he was really the first modern writer. He was writing in the vernacular, in Anglo-Saxon, modern English. But it really wasn't until the 18th and the 19th centuries that the Abbey starts to really be filled with great monuments to our writers. And here we can see a whole host of writers, including, just on the right, Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was Poet Laureate in the 19th century. He gave us those wonderful words, "It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." And he's buried underneath that, the inscription. And on the right, you can just see out of shot, is the grave of Robert Browning, another wonderful 19th century poet. And the surrounding names are all memorials. T.S. Eliot, to the left of Tennyson there, was an American-born poet who came to England in the early 20th century, became a naturalised British citizen, was actually voted our nation's favourite poet in 2008. And just moving over, just to give us another variety of memorials. And this is actually Charles Dickens, who is buried there. Lots of people didn't want to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Dickens was one of them, but he was buried against his wishes because he was considered to, of course, to be the greatest writer of the 19th century. And you've got Thomas Hardy next to him on the right, whose body is there, but his heart is in Dorset, where his novels were set. And Rudyard Kipling, who is the creator of the Jungle Book, who's also buried there. Now, just to give you a little flavour of the everyday life of Westminster Abbey, this is a rather nice, jolly image of the, I should say, former and current deans of Westminster Abbey. So formerly the Abbey was run by monks, so an abbot and monks. And then following the Reformation, Elizabeth I refounded Westminster Abbey as a royal peculiar. And what that means is that it is under the direct jurisdiction of the monarch. So today that's Queen Elizabeth II. And the dean is the modern equivalent of the abbot. So on the left-hand side, you can see the former dean, the very Reverend Dr. John Hall, and he retired just last year, and he was replaced by his successor on the right-hand side, and that's David Hoyle. So he is the current dean of Westminster Abbey, a very powerful position in the life of the nation. They preside over actually a whole team of 800 people who are responsible for running Westminster Abbey, a team of paid staff and indeed a wonderful team of volunteers. And now we just move on to this image of music in the Abbey. And again, music has been part and parcel of the life of the Abbey since the monks were here in the 10th century. On the right-hand side, we can see the beautiful choir stalls. And of course, you know, this is a place of worship, and there are 1,500 services every year, and 8 times a week there is a sung service. And you can see on the left-hand side the world-famous Westminster Abbey choir. You can see those angelic little boys who are part of the Westminster Abbey Choir School. So we have a dedicated choir school. Boys from the age of 8 to 13, around 30 of them attend full-time musical and academic education at a school within the precincts of the building. And of course, they sing not only for the great events like the coronations and the royal weddings, but also they make recordings, they sing internationally, and what a great honour that is. They're also accompanied by 12 lay choristers who are adult choristers who are also lay vicars. And just at the bottom, there's a lovely image of their recreation time. So very, very much, you know, modern boys. We move on to the next image, and just I like the idea of this continuity of craftsmanship as well. These 3 statues are 3 of 10, which stand above the west door of Westminster Abbey. And although they look like they might be from the time of King Henry III, they are in fact from the 1990s. In 1995, the Abbey completed a 25-year restoration programme, and it was decided to fill these blank niches above the west door. And the theme that was chosen was Christian martyrs of the 20th century. On the left-hand side, you can see Martin Luther King with his finger pointing in the air. In the middle, you can see Bishop Oscar Romero, who's holding a child. And on the right-hand side, you can see Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Lutheran pastor. So you have a Baptist on the left, a Roman Catholic in the middle, and a Lutheran on the right. So these are all people that come from all different strands of the Christian faith, and they've all been killed or have died for their beliefs. And I rather like the idea that, again, the Westminster Abbey is not just this great English church, this great British church, it's also the church of the world. And visitors from all over the world can identify and recognise figures, no matter whether they have faith or whether they have no faith at all. It's a very welcoming place, I think, in that regard. And it just highlights the fact that we still have these wonderful stonemasons who work for the Abbey today. And just finally, or second, I think to last slide, we have this beautiful image. Kate referenced the medieval stained glass. This is the newest window in the Abbey, unveiled in 2018 by one of our greatest contemporary British artist, David HOCKNEY, very famous for landscapes. And it was decided that we wanted to honour the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, and it was decided that we should create a window of celebration where there had been a blank window. And so David HOCKNEY actually created this beautiful image on his iPad. And his reasoning behind it was that whereas traditional stained glass windows are backlit by natural light, iPads are lit from the back by modern means. And you can see beautiful images of the English countryside, and the Queen, of course, is a great lover of the outdoors. So that was the link there. It's very controversial windows. Some people love it, some people hate it. But I love the idea that, in fact, the Abbey is always moving, it's always changing, it's always moving with the times. And finally, just one rather nice series of images. One part of the Abbey that's often, again, overlooked unless you're with a guide, are the beautiful gardens. The garden on the left and the bottom right is, in fact, the oldest continuously cultivated garden in the country. The monks had a medicinal herb garden here, and the herbs were used, of course, to treat the monks when they were sick. But it was also a garden for rest and relaxation. And we still have a team of gardeners that take care of these beautiful gardens at the Abbey today. So it's a really nice place to show people. And it's a little bit hidden away, sort of at the end of the cloister. People wouldn't always know to go there. So it's a lovely end to a visit to Westminster Abbey. So there we are. I hope that's given you a little insight into some of the aspects of modern life at Westminster Abbey, and some more ideas about the things that you'll be able to see when you come and visit. So again, any of my colleagues, including myself, can be found at Guide London, www.guidelondon.org.uk, and we very much look forward to showing you what is arguably the greatest church in the world when you come to London. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you so much. And Kate as well, thank you so much. Two fascinating talks. I think you've really explained why, if you're coming to visit Westminster Abbey, hire a guide to show you around. There's so much in the Abbey to see, and having a Blue Badge guide with you will allow you to see some of those things that you can easily miss if you wander around on your own. It is, of course, a working church. It's not open at the moment, but Kate, perhaps you can tell us something about the services that people can go and see when the Abbey is open.
Yes, as Simon said, there's a great range of services, nearly all of them with the wonderful choir, of which we saw a picture. The best service for visitors is the one at 5 o'clock on weekdays or 3 o'clock on weekends, which is choral evensong, open to all faiths and none, with the most beautiful music, ranging from music written in the 1400s right up to music that the Abbey commissions today for its services. And on that note, the Abbey has had services every day since 1213, which was the end of a period when the Pope, Innocent III, banned John and England from having any religious services because of a big row that they'd had. And it's sobering to think that since then, and throughout the time of the church we see today, they've been daily services. But the Abbey continues to have podcast services even through the crisis, and recordings which you can hear on their website from the choir.
Yes, that's obviously an advantage we have here that they didn't have in the 13th century, that you can go to the internet. The Abbey address is actually westminster-abbey.org. If you go there, you can download prayers, and you can download the podcast that Kate was talking about there. So that's well worth a visit. Simon, the Queen often visits the Abbey. Do you know when she last came, and what sort of things does she come to the Abbey for?
Well, she does attend services. There is in February every year, there's a service for the Commonwealth on Commonwealth Day. And of course, the Queen is the head of the Commonwealth, so she'll attend that. She also paid, of course, she attends obviously her family's weddings. And she also visited on the anniversary of her Diamond Jubilee in 2013. So yes, she does visit and attend regularly.
Great. Thank you both very much. We've had visitors, we've had people watching from all over the world, from Argentina, from Brazil, from Norway. So thank you for watching. Do come to London and hire a guide when you come, and we'll take you into the Abbey and show you the wonders of the Abbey. If you want to know more about our guides, then the best place to go, as Simon and Kate said, is our website, guidelondon.org.uk. There you can search for tours, you can search for guides. And one of the tours you can search is Westminster Abbey. That will tell you a little bit more about things you can see in the Abbey, details of all the tombs and the monuments there. And down the bottom of the page, there's a form to fill in, and you can fill that in with your name, your email, and everything. And one of the Blue Badge guides, one of the members of the APTG, will get back to you and tell you exactly how they can enhance your visit to London. But thank you everyone for watching today. On Friday, we're going to be back with Caroline Piper. Now, Caroline Piper is going to be talking with 3 other Blue Badge guides about some of our less known monarchs and some of the less regarded monarchs. And they're going to have a discussion about which one of 3 monarchs should be thrown out a lifeboat if necessary. And they are Richard III, Charles I, and Queen Anne. So if you've got any strong feelings on those monarchs, do tune in on Friday, 4 p.m. if you're watching in the UK. That's 11 a.m. if you're watching in the East Coast of America, and view that. If you want to watch Simon and Kate's presentation again, then go to YouTube and you can find it on Guide London, either on YouTube or on our Facebook page. But from the 3 of us, from Simon, from Kate, and from me, from all of us for the moment, goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.